Hey guys, welcome to Beklaedt's YouTube channel. If you are new to the channel, please remember to hit the subscribe button so you never miss out on new video guides, tips and tricks and much more. My name is Iben and in today's video I'll show you how I make my quilted jacket, Tang. This jacket is constructed with a yoke on the front and back and princess seams, which are details that helps to add shape and make the jacket different. The jacket also has a wide collar and pockets on the front. The jacket closes with a button-down closure on the front. If you want to, you can finish all the seams with bias binding, which gives a beautiful finish. You can buy the sewing pattern on my website, Beklaedt.com. Okay, let's get started. The jacket is made for quilted fabrics, which is fabric that consists of 3 layers. An outer layer, a layer of batting, and then lining. I have made my own quilted fabric, but you can buy ready-made fabric too. The outer layer is a green silk jacquard that I bought off a lady who got this silk in China in the 90s without ever getting a chance to use it. The lining is a plain weave cotton with print. The batting layer is micro-batting 60 grams. I'll show you in another video how you can quilt your own fabric. We also need a lot of bias tape or bias binding. Five buttons for the button closure and matching thread. I am making my own piping ribbon. To do this I need a cord of sorts, which can be a thick yarn or something similar. I start by cutting the pattern pieces according to the cutting guide. Instead of laying the fabric double, I cut every pattern piece twice. Just remember to make the second pattern piece a mirror image of the first. I cut those pieces that are supposed to be on the fold by flipping the piece in over itself along the fold line. That way I can mirror the piece without cutting by the fold line. I cut one half first, without cutting along the fold line, flip it and then cut the mirrored piece. Start by finding the front middle piece and the front side piece. Place the side piece on top of the middle piece and stitch the pieces together along the princess seam 1 cm from the edge. Afterwards, cut a piece of bias tape in the same length as the seam. Place the open edge of the bias binding against the seam on the front middle piece. Stitch the bias binding to the fabric by stitching right in the fold. After this, the bias binding is folded around the seam allowance, so the seam allowance is completely covered under the binding. If you are a beginner with respect to sewing bias binding, then I recommend using lots of pins. Personally, I prefer to work without pins, but it's just my personal preference. I always finish by sewing the bias binding in place from the same side I started on. This side will be facing up, so it also needs to be the prettiest. I fold the bias binding while sewing, while I use the fingers on my right hand to feel if the bias binding is correctly placed on the back side. Again, if you don't feel so confident working with bias binding, it really helps to add pins beforehand. I stitch the binding in place by making a stitch 1 to 2 mm inside the binding that catches the other side through the layers. From the right side of the jacket, I top stitch the seam allowance with the bias binding in place. Press the seam allowance towards the front side piece and top stitch approximately 7 mm from the edge that catches the seam allowance, that is, the bias binding, through the jacket. Cut a piece of bias binding the same length as the lower edge of the 2 front yokes. Cut a piece of cord or yarn in the same length. Place the cord inside the open tape and close the bias binding with pins. Switch to a zipper foot and stitch the piping by making a stitch as close to the inner cord as possible. Cut the piping in 2 pieces. Trim away the outer few millimeters so the distance from the stitch we just did to the edge of the piping is exactly 1 centimeter. After this, you should place the piping on the lower edge of the front yoke, so the newly trimmed edge of the piping is aligned with the yoke piece. Stitch the piping in place. I would normally use a zipper foot for this, but since the inner yarn or cord is so soft, it works with a normal presser foot. Try whatever works for you. Place the front yoke on top of the gathered front pieces, right sides together, and stitch the pieces together along the horizontal edge with a 1 cm seam allowance. Afterwards, I finish the seam with bias binding, the same way I did before. I place the bias binding on top of the lower front pieces, because this side will be the visible side. Afterwards, I fold the bias binding around the seam allowance and stitch it in place 1 to 2 mm from the edge, just like I did before. Turn the jacket around so the right side is facing up. Press the seam allowance with the bias binding towards the neckline and top stitch it in place approximately 7 mm from the edge. Find the 2 pockets. We are going to attach bias binding all around the edges of the pockets. I start by placing the bias binding between the 2 rounded corners on the right side. Make sure to let the bias binding be about 3 cm longer at the beginning. I start stitching about 1 cm after the middle of the pocket. Open up the binding and stitch right in the fold up until the sharp corner. Stop approximately 1 cm before you reach the top edge. From this point, you should pivot the pocket and continue the stitching at a 45-degree angle right to the end of the corner. The corner is made by folding the bias binding by the 45-degree angle, so it lays perpendicular to the side seam. Then fold the bias binding again so it is aligned with the top edge of the pocket. Place a pin. Continue stitching the binding in place. Start right at the folded edge. Stop by the other corner and do the same thing again. Continue down the other side seam until you are about 2 centimeters away from the starting point. Close the gap by pressing the 2 open ends of the binding against each other, so they are aligned with the pocket. Place a pin where the binding should be stitched together. And close off the gap. Trim away the loose ends of the binding and fold it around the pocket seam allowance. At the corner, I fold the binding twice on the back side to shape the corner. Place a pin. Finish by stitching the bias binding in place from the right side 1 to 2 mm from the edge of the binding that catches the other side through the pocket. I start and stop the stitching between the 2 rounded corners. Place the pocket on the front piece so the middle of the pocket is placed on top of the princess seam. The bottom edge of the pocket should be placed 4 cm above the lower edge of the jacket. Sew the pocket to the jacket along the side and the bottom, but leave the top part of the pocket open. The back pieces are gathered the same way as the front pieces. Place the 2 back side pieces on top of the back middle piece, right sides together, and stitch the pieces together with a 1 cm seam allowance. Finish off the seam allowance with bias binding. Cut 2 pieces of bias binding, the same length as the seam allowance. Place the bias binding on the middle back piece. The open binding should be aligned with the edge. Stitch the binding in place by stitching right in the fold. Fold the binding around the seam allowance and place pins if you prefer. Stitch the binding in place the same way as before. Turn the layers around so the right side is facing up. Like before, top stitch the seam allowance in place 7 mm from the edge. Press the seam allowance towards the back side piece. Attach piping to the back yoke piece like we did to the front yokes. Place the back yoke piece on top of the lower back pieces, right sides together, and stitch the pieces together by the horizontal edge. Finish by adding bias binding like the other times. The bias binding should be attached to the lower back pieces first, after which it is folded around the seam allowance. Stitch it in place from the right side, which is the side we started on. Press the seam allowance towards the neckline. From the right side, top stitch the seam allowance in place 7 mm from the edge. The two front pieces and the back piece are stitched together by the shoulder seams, right sides together. Finish by adding bias binding to the seam allowance. Top stitch the seam allowance to the front piece of the jacket. Find the two collars and place them on top of each other, wrong sides together. Stitch the layers together by the outer edge approximately 5 mm from the edge. Finish by adding bias binding to the outer edge of the collar. Choose which collar you want to face outwards. This side should face up when you attach bias binding. Stitch the binding the same way I did the pockets. Use pins if you want to. Fold the binding around the back side of the collar. Stitch the binding in place from the right side. Find the upper sleeves. Place piping along the straight edge and stitch it in place 1 cm from the edge. Place the lower sleeve on top, right sides together, and stitch the two sleeve pieces together 1 cm from the edge. Finish by adding bias binding to the seam allowance. Stitch the bias binding to the lower sleeve piece first, then fold the binding around the seam allowance and stitch it in place while the lower sleeve is still facing up. Press the seam allowance towards the upper sleeve and top stitch it in place 7 mm from the edge. Find the two front facings and the neck facing. I have finished the shoulder seam with an overlock seam as I want to split open the seam to avoid too much bulk on the shoulder. Place the neck facing on top of the front facings, right sides together, and stitch the pieces together 1 cm from the edge along the shoulder seams. Remember to split open the seam allowance afterwards. Finish the outer edge, that is, the edge pointing away from the neckline, with the bias binding all the way around. Find the collar and attach it to the neckline of the jacket. The outwards facing side should face up while the undercollar sits next to the jacket. I start by finding the center back on the collar and the center back on the jacket, which are matched with each other. Then I attach the rest of the collar to the neckline with lots of pins. Make a small ribbon that is to be placed at the neck from a 10 cm long piece of bias binding. Fold it along the middle and stitch it together. The ribbon should be placed so that the raw edge is 1.5 cm from the center back. I forgot to do this while filming, so I'll show you in a short while how it's done. Find the facing and place it on top of the collar and jacket, right sides together, and pin the facing to the neckline. Remember to match the shoulder seam with each other. Stitch the layers together by the neckline. As we have a lot of layers to keep track of, I recommend taking it slow. Finish by snipping small notches into the seam allowance along the neckline to get a nice curved edge. We have a lot of fabric to cut through, so it helps snipping into only one layer at a time. Okay, As you can see, I have unpicked some of the neck seam to be able to get the little ribbon into place by the neck. But you really shouldn't do this. You should remember to stitch the ribbon when you attach the facing. Now it's time to set in the sleeves. Find each sleeve and attach them to each armhole, right sides together, remembering that the sleeve has a distinctive front and back. I start by matching the shoulder marking on the sleeve cap to the shoulder seam on the jacket. Then I continue by adding pins along the armhole. If you are able to, it looks good to match the piping on the sleeve with the piping on the back yoke. It can be a bit difficult, so if the seams do not align perfectly, it's also not the end of the world as long as the sleeves are symmetrical on either side. Stitch the sleeves to the body with a 1 cm seam allowance. I usually let the sleeve face downwards towards the sewing machine as I find it easier to manage this way. Finish by adding bias binding to the sleeve cap. You don't have to top stitch this particular seam allowance in place afterwards, so it doesn't really matter which way you sew in the binding. But other than that, the procedure is the same. Now we need to close the side seams of the jacket. Place the sleeve and side pieces on top of each other, right sides together, and place pins. I make sure to match the armhole from the front and back jacket with each other. Press the seam from the armhole towards the body. Stitch the side seam in one continuous stitch using a 1 cm seam allowance. Start by the wrist. Stitch over the armhole. And finish by the bottom edge of the jacket. Finish by adding bias binding to the seam. Grab the front facing and turn it around so it now lays on the inside of the jacket, which means the wrong side of the facing lays next to the wrong side of the jacket. Secure with pins. Before stitching the facing in place, I start by attaching the neck loop to the neck facing, approximately 5 mm from the edge. Stitch the facing in place while the right side of the jacket is facing up. Stitch 5 mm from the edge. When you reach the neckline, you should press the collar away from the jacket and continue stitching around the neckline to secure the collar. Finish by stitching down the other front facing. We are now going to attach bias binding to the outer edge of the jacket. Let the bias binding be about 3 cm longer when you start by the right collar. Continue adding the bias binding to the outer edge all around the jacket and finish by the left collar, where you should again leave about 3 cm extra binding to be able to make a fold. I fold the binding in under itself. Trim the binding so it is about 2 cm long. Fold it while it is closed over itself before pressing the binding towards the inside of the jacket to completely cover the raw edge. I know it can be a bit fiddly to get it right, so you might need to try a few times. When you are happy, add a pin and stitch the binding in place from the right side all around the jacket. Finish the raw edges of the sleeves with bias binding. I think it's easier if you start by turning the inside of the jacket out and then placing the binding on the right side. Use the same technique with respects to closing the binding as I showed you for the pocket. Mark the placement of 5 buttonholes on the right side of the front jacket. I usually use the buttons to visualize how I want the buttons to be placed. The first button is placed right under the neckline, which is marked by a horizontal pin. My buttons are 20 mm wide. In order to get the center of the button to lay on the center fold line, which is 2 cm away from the outer edge, I measure 1.5 cm inwards on the front piece and place a vertical pin. This will be the start of the buttonhole. Then I measure 2.1 cm inwards again and place another vertical pin to mark the length of the buttonhole. I place each button with a vertical distance of 10 cm to each other. If your buttons have other dimensions than mine, you might need to place your buttons differently. Stitch the buttonholes and cut them open carefully. Mark the placement of the buttons on the left front piece and sew them by hand. I place my buttons on the center fold line, that is 2 cm inwards from the edge. The last thing we need to do is to close the little hole by the bias banding next to the collar. I do this by making a couple of stitches by hand, which gives the nicest result. Alright, that's the jacket done. I hope you'll like your new jacket and use it as much as possible. Please remember that you can buy the pattern for the jacket on my website, Beklaedt.com. If you liked this video, please give it a like. You are also welcome to share it with your friends. Remember to subscribe to my YouTube channel so you never miss out on new sewing tutorials, tips and tricks, and much more. Bye now!